Welcome to Capital Forum's 7th Annual Antitrust Thought Leaders Interview Series, sponsored by KL Discovery. My name is Jed Goldfarb. I'm here, joined today by Aimee DeFilippo of Jones Day. Aimee, this time last year, the FTC was made up of an entirely different group of commissioners. Every commissioner on today's FTC has been there for less than a year. What are your impressions about this new slate of commissioners?
Well, you're right. I mean, this is definitely a new group of commissioners. I think, even 6 months ago, Commissioner Wilson wasn't sitting, and so they're acclimating to being commissioners, and they're acclimating to interacting with each other as commissioners. I think, even though it is early, I think there's probably a few things we could talk about that is kind of a hallmark so far of this group of commissioners. The first would be, and this I think really comes from Chairman Simons, this propensity, this openness to hearing new views. And there's lots of new views to be heard, as you're probably following. I mean, there's think tanks, and there's certainly politicians, and there's people inside and outside the bar that are really, calling into question, I think, some things that even a few years ago we really didn't call into question. They're really looking closely at tech markets, and they're looking closely at vertical deals and levels of concentration and whether there's really been under-enforcement. And all of those things are, I think, creating pressure on the agencies and have led to this openness on the part of the Commission to really look at all of that and think about it and examine whether evolving business practices and the changing economy and new technologies and things require an adjustment in the way the FTC enforces the antitrust laws. And so they've had the FTC hearings, which are have been occurring for the last several months. I think there's more to come. It'd be great to get a report out of that, but I mean, there's a lot of dialogue that's happening through that. You've got the appointment of the Technology Task Force that is happening at the FTC that I think is a big deal. So it's definitely a commission that is kind of listening externally and willing to hear the dialogue and potentially make changes. The other thing I think you can really say is this is a group of commissioners with really strong views. I think we saw this no more clearly than earlier this year in January when they came out with their case in the Staples Ascendant matter, when they basically agreed to, it was a vertical transaction where Staples was buying Ascendant being the largest wholesaler of office supplies, and lots of people were watching that given kind of this rhetoric about vertical transactions, given the DOJ's suit in the AT&T Time Warner case, given some kind of critique of behavioral remedies. I think lots of people were watching that. And what we saw out of the statements was a real dialogue among the commissioners. There was the majority statement. There was two separate dissents from Commissioner Chopra and Commissioner Slaughter. There was a separate statement, a fourth statement by Commissioner Wilson, really, responding, I think, a little bit more directly to some of the statements in the dissent. And it was this real dialogue among them, which was really interesting to see, and really, I think, exposed this divide among them, this rift, this real divergence in terms of how to think about, again, things that I think a few years ago were not questioned all that much, theories of harm and on the vertical side, and the appropriateness of behavioral remedies, and things like the motivations of PE buyers kind of came out in this case, and it was really interesting to see.
Great. And given this, what do you foresee for the future in terms of merger enforcement at the FTC?
I think for transactions that are going to touch on some of the issues that we talked about, where they're raising vertical theories, where you're dealing with tech, where where there's a remedy that's being proposed that's behavioral and not structural. I think you could see longer investigations. I think the agency is going to really take its time on those. In light of a lot of the things that it's hearing, and in light of some of the criticism, and in light of the Technology Task Force, I think all of that means potentially longer investigations. I think you could see more 3-2s like we've seen before. I think an interesting thing will be to see if you've got a recusal on the Republican side, you're looking at results of 2-2, which means the agency can't vote out a complaint. So I think it'll be interesting. There's such a climate right now that I think it will be a little tougher for those deals that implicate some of those issues we talked about. Okay,
you mentioned vertical cases like AT&T Time Warner and Staples Ascendant. Unlike the horizontal merger guidelines, which have existed for decades with several updates, can you give us an update on the non-horizontal merger guidelines?
Well, they haven't been updated since 1984, And I've heard that there are, calls to update them, and certainly at the hearings, there were hearings that focused on vertical theories, and I think that was a topic that came up. It's just hard for me to imagine. I mean, to have guidelines come out, you, I think, need to get the agencies in a room and really have some consensus. And it's hard at this point, I think, to imagine the agencies, given that DOJ, difference between DOJ and the majority at the FTC in terms of vertical theories of harm. I think it would be tough to see that happen.
Okay. So you mentioned Staples Ascendant. That's one of the cases where merger retrospectives came up. Why were they even an issue in that case?
They were an issue because Commissioner Slaughter, in her dissent, raised them as maybe a way to look back. So she was making the point that the Staples Ascendant case was a closed case in her view. And she was essentially saying, in closed cases, the commission should publicly commit to go back and look at what happened. Were the predictions accurate? And it was interesting. She commented that she thought doing that would disincentivize the parties, knowing that may be coming in the future, would disincentivize the parties from making sweeping claims about pro-competitive benefits and efficiencies that could come from a transaction. That would kind of tame those in the investigation phase, and it would also incentivize the parties post-close to behave in a more pro-competitive manner. And the majority said, we agree that retrospectives are a good thing, essentially, but that they take a lot of resources and we're resource constrained. And Commissioner Wilson in particular really honed in on the retrospective piece and talked about that she generally agreed that retrospectives were a good thing, but that she I think her words were that she was wary of clearing deals and then kind of simultaneously threatening to undo them, and what that might do to the parties as they've closed their deal, whether that would, change any incentives, for instance, for the buyer to invest in the target if it thought in the future that transaction could be unwound.
Okay, thanks. Is there any historical precedent for retrospectives in merger deal?
There's lots, yeah. And the FTC does it. So the FTC has their Section 6B authority, which lets them subpoena data and documents, information from companies, independent of any investigation of those companies, just as part of a study. And it's done that, I think, periodically over the decades with some success. I think the most, the biggest example of a successful merger retrospective was in 2002 when the agency stepped back after having lost a series of hospital mergers in the 90s and really assessed, what had happened and looking at some transactions that had unfolded that they hadn't challenged, and seeing what were the effects of those. And I think, so they subpoenaed data and documents from the parties on a handful of deals, and ultimately concluded that the courts in the FTC's view were relying on a flawed methodology of trying to determine whether a transaction would harm competition, and that the courts had really, through their analysis, failed to detect mergers that were anti-competitive. And through this retrospective, the FTC saw that there were price effects from transactions, that quality really hadn't improved in their view, and so it embarked on this kind of new approach to FTC, to the FTC bringing hospital merger cases, a very successful approach, and they now have a whole new way to think about the dynamics of competition in hospital mergers, and they've been able to convince courts. They now have several appellate court decisions in their favor. So that was I would say a striking success from a retrospective. The other instance that really stands out is the divestiture studies that the FTC has done. So they've gone back. They did this in the 90s, and they refreshed it again a few years ago, where they look at a whole series of transactions that were resolved with divestitures to see if the remedial objectives of the divestitures really panned out. And I think they found, for the most part, they do. But from those studies, I think the agency has really determined that what's important is standalone businesses, upfront buyers, not just the assets going, but requiring things like IP and know-how and technology. So it really, again, resulted in, I think, this change of agency approach. So they have done them, and they've done them, I think, with some success, and that's caused some real changes in what they do.
And what's the depth of the inquiry on the retrospective on a divestiture? Are they just looking to see whether the buyer is still in business and acting as competitive constraint, or whether the industry is itself as competitive as they thought it would be after the...
Yeah, they're trying to see if if competition was preserved, because that's the goal of divestiture, is to make sure that competition is preserved as a result of the transaction. And so they're looking at, whether that buyer was able to kind of step in the shoes. The buyer that divested assets was really able to step in the shoes and compete effectively. And so, and again, in those early cases from the 90s, they saw that for some transactions where you were only getting maybe a hodgepodge of assets from here and there, it was hard for the buyer without the technology, the IP, some of the other things that should have gone maybe with the divested assets that did not.
Okay, and I know we have some limit on our resources, at least the regulators do. But I mean, are these retrospectives a good thing for refining the practice of antitrust and predictability of these deals?
I think they are. I mean, the examples we gave, the examples we talked about hospitals and divestiture studies, I think those have really resulted in improvements. I think, there are, as you said, there's resource constraints, and I think the agency will do these in the future, and they'll pick things that have broad applicability, like divestitures and those types of things. They'll pick things that are agency priorities, like hospitals certainly were in the 2000s, and focus on those. The trick with retrospectives is always, getting the data and then designing a study that's really going to yield meaningful information. And for merger retrospectives in particular, the agencies really know how to do that, and they have shown that they can do it well.
Right. You mentioned that the FTC seems to be open to listening to new views and increasing transparency into its thinking and processes. Last summer, it published its first model timing agreement. Why do you think they did that, and what do you think it accomplishes?
I think they didn't have one before. They never had one, and the DOJ had one. And so what you found as a practitioner was you'd have a deal, you'd go into mergers 2, you'd agree on a timing agreement, and then you had another deal, and you go into mergers 3, and they were asking for a whole, different things, and they were agreeing to different things or insisting on different things, and it was frustrating as from a counseling perspective. And I think it's a step in the right direction to have a model timing agreement where I'm sure the FTC kind of took the best from all the merger shops, and put them together. And I think that's really useful for the bar because it allows us to show that to our clients and really try to increase predictability.
Okay. How does the FTC's model agreement differ from the DOJ's?
Well, there's lots of similarities. I mean, both model timing agreements really focus on streamlining the negotiation of the timing agreement clearly, making things go a little bit faster, making them be more predictable and uniform, increasing transparency, obviously, but also, the differences are significant too. Again, the DOJ had a model timing agreement before, and they put out a new one that I think improved it, and they're just a little bit farther along in their thinking. So their timing agreement is longer than the FTC's, and the DOJ's timing agreement is more specific. So it caps things like the number of custodians and the number of depositions, and it gets into a lot of detail on privilege log and on how much time you need to produce data before you can certify substantial compliance. So it's much more specifics than the FTC's. The FTC has a little bit more wiggle room, and I think the FTC has given itself a little bit more time on the back end. So I think under the FTC's model timing agreement, you certify substantial compliance, and they've given themselves 60 to 90 days, and at the DOJ, I think it's just 60 days. So yeah, there certainly are differences between the two.
Okay, and are the differences material enough for you to have a preference between the DOJ and FTC?
There's so many reasons to have a preference between one or the other. There's so many reasons parties care about which agency they're in front of that I think this is not high on that list, but it is an example clearly of where just another example of a little bit of a different approach between the agencies.
Okay, thanks, Aimee. How would you, in general, just in conclusion, characterize today's enforcement environment?
I think it's a really fun time to be an antitrust lawyer because more than ever, at least in my time of practice, antitrust is in the news. As we've talked about, there are all of these, it's going to be part of a presidential platforms. It's going to be part of the discussions, I think, just general discussions among folks in the community completely outside the antitrust bar. These questions of Facebook and Google and Amazon, and are these companies too big, and do the antitrust laws, are they currently adequate to address concerns in kind of these new markets and this new economy we live in? So I think it's a really challenging time if you've got some certain types of transactions ahead. But but for the most part, it's fun, and I don't think there will be massive swings in terms of enforcement unless we're potentially talking about some of these areas where the agencies are certainly paying close attention.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Aimee, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Thanks.